I grew up in the Saar Valley in Germany, but very close to the French border. And my first experience was the life as a neighbor to France, with the reconciliation between France and Germany being the absolutely central theme of the first years of my life. When I was 7 years old, General de Gaulle and the German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer got together in the Cathedral of Reims in a famous mass and a famous political act. And I remember, this is one of my first memories, that my mother and my father and my family, I have a sister, we were sitting at the television screen watching what was happening in Reims, in this wonderful cathedral, and my mother and my father were crying, because this was, for them, a huge step forward. So it was very emotional, in a very positive sense. And all the cruel war experience was not forgotten, but they deliberately wanted to leave it behind. I give you another example of this positive reconciliation attitude. In 1965, the British Queen Elizabeth visited Germany for the first time after the war, and she was taking a boat on the River Rhine. And along the shores of the Rhine, the people were standing, holding up signboards, and you could read on these, written in German, of course, "We welcome our Queen." What did "our" mean? Well, these people did not know that, in fact, the House of Windsor was the House of Hanover at the end of the day. So it was a German, in fact, a German Queen. Most of them didn't know that. But they loved the Queen as a symbol of European identity. This was another great experience. And I give you a third example. The third example came a bit later. This is very private, my very private life. My parents decided at some time that I should spend my vacations not anymore with them, that was becoming a little bit boring, but with the French family. So another example of the reconciliation. And that happened from 1969, 1970 on. I was befriended to a French family Pinson, living in Quimper in Bretagne. And we always split the vacations. I spent 2 weeks in Brittany, and Philippe, my good friend, came for 2 weeks to Germany, to the Saar Valley. And that was at the age of 13, beginning at the age of 13. And that was a wonderful experience that left deep traces for the rest of my life. We were also, on one of these occasions, we were traveling together to Berlin with my classmates in the Gymnasium, in the high school, a standard procedure in Germany at the time to get the experience of German division. And I remember well that we spent one day in the socialist or communist eastern part of the city, and he was easily let in, and we were checked very carefully because he was still one of the son of one of the four Allied forces, Britain, US, France, and the Soviet Union at the time. So we experienced Europe together. So it's all positive at that time. And I grew up with the feeling that the past is over and a very promising future begins. In fact, as a child and a pupil at school, I think that was the only narrative. Later this changed strongly so, because as an economist, I studied economics in the 1970s, partly in America and Canada. I took over more and more a globalized view of Europe, and I became much more in academics as a professor of economics later. I became much more submerged in the, let's say, British Anglo-American perspective on Europe. Still very positive on European integration, but not centered around French-German reconciliation anymore.
Right.
Well, there is a different generation with different experiences, and the farther away we move from the shadow of the Second World War, the less the reconciliation story conveys emotional content. And maybe even in my own thinking, it is like a sediment which never disappears, but which fades a little bit into the background. The main reason, objectively, however, is globalization. That in fact the world began to change, globalization, digitalization. Europe became smaller. For a while this was overshadowed, positively overshadowed, by the fall of the Iron Curtain, which was in a sense the last positive step of creating this European identity. And the time 1990 to roughly 2005 were a mythical peak of this spirit. And we of course thought it would go on, but it didn't go on. And this was the evolutionary thing. But then what happened was the financial crisis, with the European debt crisis, and then the refugee crisis. And these two crises changed the baseline and the confidence. Europe was not able to solve the emerging problems. Well, we muddled through, and I think we muddled through not so unsuccessfully. But of course, the fundamental confidence in government in general and European governance from Brussels has been shaken. And on top of this, during this time, gradually new rifts appeared in Europe between East and West, especially in the question of the refugee, with respect to the refugee issues. By the way, a rift which goes right through Germany. And a second gap between North and South, which has less to do with refugees, but much more to do with the debt crisis. And these are really huge problems. I think, I'm not pessimistic, we are on a good path to not solve the problems completely, but in the positive sense of modeling through. And we have an opportunity in the future to re-establish a positive spirit, but it's getting more difficult than it was in the past.